if you're going to look at the Enlightenment as the use of reason, a logical, serious, sober approach to the problems of society, then you can really find few better examples to begin with than Mary Wollstonecraft, whose work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, was a groundbreaking treatise in the history of philosophy. It is a founding document of feminism. Different groups can latch onto her for a number of different reasons, but this work is remarkable from a number of ways. The character of Mary Wollstonecraft is part of that. She led a significant, although short, life. She was born in 1759 in London. She died less than 40 years later, complications of childbirth. Medicine was not particularly good in those days, especially for female problems, let's say. And she came into a family that was middle class, but on the downward slide. Her childhood was a bit disruptive. There are reports of a father who was somewhat abusive, perhaps alcoholic, and who suffered one financial failure after another, increasing a degree of tension in the household, certainly, and certainly creating a, one would imagine, unstable, irrational, male-dominated environment where the women in the household, Mary, her sister, and her mom, were particularly vulnerable. And I think this may have had, and you can go crazy with this if you want, this may have had a somewhat searing effect on the young Mary. But when she grew to adulthood, she pursued a remarkable career as an essayist, as a feminist, as a social reformer. And yes, she did go on to be the mother of the author of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. Now, she died just a few days after the birth of Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley's birth was the precipitating event of Wollstonecraft's death. It's very unfortunate. But certainly, this, you can see in this bloodline a remarkable degree of writing craft and intellect, and those qualities are very much on display in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It comes out in 1792 in the height of the rebellion in France, the height of revolution. A spirit of revolution was overflowing in France, and the concerns over in London just across the way were pretty significant. She was taking advantage of a certain gestalt for rethinking society, rethinking what people can do. And of course, the rights of woman is a bit of a twist on that. This was a very deliberate take. She had written a treatise called A Vindication of the Rights of Man, and the rights of man were a very significant element of the, theoretical element of the French Revolution. So here she is saying, wait, there's one thing that we're overlooking. And it is a remarkable document. It is a relatively long essay, 18,000 words. Any publications of the time would be more considered pamphlets, very short things that you can read in just a few moments. This is more than that. This has some thoughts to get through, and it takes its time laying out its case. It is a very thorough intellectual project where she is demonstrating the power of female intellect, not just through the content of her argument, but rather through the form as well. Because anybody who would lift up this book and start to peruse it would probably judge it on style matters first. And if she just came off as kind of glib and thin or unsupported, unsubstantiated, then that would undercut the argument she was trying to make. So she made this a very substantive review of the issue. And in it, she debates some of the leading figures of the day. Talleyrand over in France, who had just proposed some rather insulting ideas about about the education of women. Rousseau, a leading light of the day at the height of his influence, also a bit of a misogynist in terms of female prominence in society, and specifically he had, yes, also undercut the idea of why should women be educated. Well, they should be educated just to entertain men. That's pretty much their only role. That got under Mary Wollstonecraft's skin. But also figures as great as John Locke, and minor figures like John Gregory, who had written a bit of a chapbook, which were very popular there in that time, about the behavior of daughters to their fathers. And it doesn't take long to see the somewhat patronizing and paternalistic attitudes that are very, very rampant throughout that book. And Mary Wollstonecraft goes after all of them, explicitly and implicitly, from the start to the finish. And it is a masterful treatise treating the idea of educating women. Is there a reason for it? Is there a purpose for it? Why would we even bother if they're just going to be sitting in the kitchen or maybe just raising the kids? Or, and this is significant, not even really raising the kids, but just sort of managing the household, and you have nannies for that. The parochialism of Mary Wollstonecraft's very bourgeois, middle class, comfortable perspective, I think is significant, and many critics have noted it. She is going after a audience, or an imagined demographic of women who have plenty of leisure time and no apparent needs to spend it in any other way other than educating themselves and exercising and developing their powers for reason. So that's a limitation. That's a qualification within this work that many critics have noted, but it's something to bear in mind as we go through. It doesn't negate the argument itself, but it puts it into a perspective where we can start to look at it a little bit more objectively, which is ultimately the goal of this work in its content. The idea that we need to consider things objectively, critically, intellectually, reasonably, and develop our faculties by sharpening them on these whetstones of ideas. In the introduction, she lays out her project very explicitly. I have turned over various books written on the subject of education and patiently observed the conduct of parents and the management of schools. But what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the great source of the misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct of manners in women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state. For, like the flowers that are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased the fastidious eye, fade, disregarded on the stalk, long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. But probably the strongest articulation of her argument comes in Chapter 2. We read, "This contempt of the understanding in early life has more baneful consequences than is commonly supposed. For the little knowledge which women of strong minds attain is, from various circumstances, of a more desultory kind than the knowledge of men, and it is acquired more by sheer observations in real life than from comparing what has been individually observed with the results of experience, generalized by speculation, led by the dependent situation and domestic employments more into society. What they learn is rather by snatches, And as learning is with them, in general, only a secondary thing, they do not pursue any one branch with the preserving ardor necessary to give vigor to the faculties and clearness to the judgment. Again, hammering that point of women are only taught to be decorative. Women are only taught to be silliness. And because of that, because they are never given the opportunity to really stretch their minds in a more rigorous way, a more rational way, you get a lot of dying on the vine of their intellect. They just kind of fade into the background, and they don't have the wherewithal to ever really recover from that. So Wollstonecraft is taking a fairly radical step here of saying, well, okay, let's look at education. What can we do with education? And again, there is a limitation in her bourgeois perspective of that. She's not talking about universal education by any means. She is merely arguing that polite middle class young ladies have the same opportunities as polite middle class young men to go to Cambridge or to Oxford or some of the higher realms perhaps, or maybe even just as she is, be allowed to study more vigorous subjects with a governess. She never went to college. She grew up in a household that had some books, and she educated herself largely. But throughout that time, you can see there's not a lot of support for a young lady who says, well, gee, I'd really like to learn Latin. How do I go about that? She has very few options where she can turn. And so she is bringing this back to a logical, reasonable approach to society. It is not abstract. It is talking about people today, women today, are kind of dull. They are kind of dumb, even because they have been educated to be so. But if we just give them greater opportunities based on the rational expectation that in a revolutionary age, somebody has said somewhere that all men are created equal, we should understand that women are included in that men word. They were not at the time, but the argument is fairly coherent and fairly substantiated. And she goes on to sum this up. Were women more rationally educated? Could they take a more comprehensive view of things? They would be contented to love but once in their lives, and after marriage calmly let passion subside into friendship, into that tender intimacy, which is the best refuge from care, yet is built on such pure, still affections, that idle jealousies would not be allowed to disturb the discharge of the sober duties of life, nor to engross the thoughts that ought to be otherwise employed. Couple things here. She is bringing her argument to a kind of logical conclusion about the problems with undereducated, intellectually stultified women in society. But she is also putting it in a way that men reading this would perhaps understand. Were women to be more rationally educated, could they have a more comprehensive view of things? They would be contented to love but once in their lives. So this is going after men who are worried about their wives having too much free time, perhaps, and too much surplus unexercised imagination to go looking for a dalliance somewhere, to cheat on their husbands. This is a very subtle ploy in argument here. A brilliant little turn of rhetoric on her part. Rhetoric is a classic example of reasonable reasonable articulation of ideas, of convincing people of your ideas. And here she is doing that by saying, you men out there who might be scoffing and poo-pooing the idea of having women educated, if you do that, they will perhaps have less reason to go sneaking around behind your back with a lover. And she also puts this, and you can read this also in a more perhaps autobiographical vein, recalling the tumultuous, tension filled childhood she very likely endured with a father who was a bit of an alcoholic and perhaps abusive. The idea of what is prioritized here is calmness, of reasonableness, of a kind of dispassionate, post passionate, um, elevated way of living. After marriage, calmly lets passion subside into friendship, meaning all that heated stuff, all the sexuality stuff, all of that animal stuff can just go, you get a little old, it happens. That can go away. But once that happens, then, guys, your wives will perhaps be able to carry on a conversation and you won't be so bored with them. Again, appealing to the male ego here, the male perspective, the male gaze, and trying to make an argument on that ground instead of just writing just for women who would probably be disposed to agree with her to begin with. She is thinking in terms of her audience and their expectations more than just self-expression. Well, women should be able to do this and that and that. Ladies, am I right? And you're just speaking to yourself at that point. But she has the intelligence to say, no, what if I really want to change things? If this is anything more than just an academic exercise, I have to approach the enemy. I have to approach the opposition and say, well, okay, this is why you should consider this idea more carefully. But also, again, that desire to get away from the passions is very enlightenment of her. The let calmly let passion subside into friendship, into that tender intimacy which is the best refuge from care, yet is built on such pure, still affections that idle jealousies would not be allowed to disturb the discharge and sober duties of life, nor to engross the thoughts that ought to be otherwise employed. This is prioritizing thought. This is saying, all right, let's just get past all of the physicality, all of the passionate nature of man, all of the petty jealousies, all of that little squirming, irrational, very human, animalistic even stuff, so that we can exercise our reason, so that we can think about things that really matter and perhaps make them better otherwise employed. Doing something with your mind that can help. Wollstonecraft does this very deliberately, and it is brilliant to see her do it in this very persuasive, I would have to say, argument, taking on point after point of the objections, citing them all through. Rousseau gets beat up like nobody's business, and dealing with them in a very logical, coherent, sustained way, so that by the time you get done reading the entire book, it makes sense. It seems logical, reasonable, rational. And so Wollstonecraft is, in very clear ways, a great avatar of Enlightenment thought, of trying to do something here and now, not in the abstract sense, but to improve conditions for society by reviewing the current state of things, thinking about them critically and saying, how can we do better? That's the Enlightenment.